had to happen at some point. Season 7 has finally stumbled into the realm of absolutely terrible episodes. No, I'm exaggerating. I don't like this episode. It's a bit of a shame because it's a Q episode, and I am actually a really big fan of John Delancey. He's done some good stuff over the years. And I mean, it's a Q episode. I find Q to be an interesting character, as he is generally portrayed about, say, 2/3 of the time. But sadly, this is also not the first disinteresting Q story. Cupid comes to mind immediately. At least I think that's the name of the episode. So here we have Q2, where we have Q and Q. When it's written out, I like the literary style of being Q is uppercase Q and Q is lowercase q. Just kind of fits. But for these sakes, we'll go ahead and call the little q Q2, just so that you guys don't get confused with my word choice. You know, saying it out loud kind of a thing. This episode's just not interesting. And I want to summarize why right up front. Thematically, the episode is all about earning up to something. You know, you don't just and make something happen. You and then work your way up to something. It's an interesting lesson because if you actually look at it, it's a fairly complex lesson and fairly well presented. In other words, even though going through all those tests and lessons didn't really help out Q2 in the sense of proving his worth, at the same time it absolutely did, because it built into him the, shall we say, the mental and emotional infrastructure that allowed for him to take the actions that then impressed the continuum sufficiently for Big Q in order to be able to make his argument, and for Q to be able to pull his test. In other words, without both sides of the equation it wouldn't have worked, which is kind of the point. Sometimes having power, personal power in the case of the Q, but the literal definition of power, which is the ability to do, it's not enough, but it is of course also required in addition to the backings of the why you do something and the how you do something, in addition to doing something, right? And that's basically the underpinning theme of the episode. It's good, I like that. The reason I call this ironic is the fact that the episode itself does not actually bother to build up to that point. It spends entirely too much time on the childish antics early on and completely squishes Q2's character arc to the point where he actually doesn't really have a character arc. Part of that is down to the the actor, Keegan, who is, of course, John Delancey's real-life son, for those of you not aware. Which caused some issues on set. Not big issues. There wasn't anything big. It's just John Delancey himself puts in a noticeably substandard performance this episode, and I think that's at least part of why. But it's like I've talked about so many times in many aspects of my show, but especially on Voyager. Establishment is a big deal. It's one of the reasons why I love Babylon 5 so much. If Babylon 5, everyone says Babylon 5 Season 1 was black. Well, except for me, I don't say that. But, it was obviously substandard quality compared to the rest of the Babylon 5. But if not for Season 1, the rest of it wouldn't have meant as much. This is not a hard concept to really understand when you think about it. It's establishment. It's build-up. It's back to that the frickin' parable, the really basic parable of building your house on stone instead of on sand. You build it on... So first you build the stone, then you build the house, rather than just building the house. It's sturdier, it's stronger, it lasts longer, it's better. Establishment, build up, right? And the episode doesn't do that. It's like, hey, I'm a Q, oh, I'm a Q who's totally trying to cheat. Okay, now I'm actually trying to be better, and race to the ending. The end. I've learned a lesson. And so it lacks any emotional impact. It doesn't really do much for the characters. And a lot of the individuals basically jump, like from one cut to the next, suddenly change disposition or perspective, because we're just kind of squishing all of it as much as we can, and literally relying on 4 days later kind of cuts in order to establish things, and a few montages, for God's sakes. I also wonder if the director of this episode, who I don't remember who that is off the top of my head, was putting in kind of a substandard performance. I'm looking at it right now. The director was LeVar Burton. Okay, that's immensely confusing, because I actually rather enjoy LeVar Burton's directing style, and he has a fairly distinct directing style, and this does not quite feel like that. Although he does do quite a few good perspective shots, and he does do a lot of really good camera tricks with the Q, so I guess I could give him that. So the early scenes are very boring. It's the stereotypical, I'm a kid who's out of control, I'm the uptight adult thing. I mean, it's practically The Odd Couple all over again, you know? And it's not just Q2 who's trying too hard to provoke a reaction. It's the episode trying to provoke a reaction. And my reaction was basically, for most of the early part of the episode, what's funny is their strategy of just ignore him is not exactly an invalid strategy, and probably one of the only strategies they could have employed. The interesting thing is, it worked, but not for the reasons they thought it would. See, when you have the kind of capacity that someone like Q2 has, you just keep escalating until you get a response, right? Well, he can escalate pretty far. And he does so pretty quickly. It's pretty... I would say, if I was inclined to character analyze, that he actually gets... They get under his skin very quickly. That he has extremely thin skin. And the total lack of reaction actually irritates him to the point where he escalates straight to the Borg very early on. And ergo, leads me to my point. The fact that he is incapable of dealing with the very antics that he himself is perpetuating. Because what he's doing is provoking them. But what they're doing is provoking him. It's just they're using different methods, but that is the same thing that they're both doing. Provoking him by basically ignoring him, whereas he is provoking them by constantly trying to embarrass them or to get their attention or whatever. Also, I'm just going to roll my eyes at the 7 scene, and the fact that later on... I get why they did this, but Q2 seems just a little bit too fixated on females for my taste. It seems weird, especially in context with everything else we know about the Q. Anyways, so then we have probably one of the very few realistic fights against the Borg in Star Trek history. I'd say one of 3. And it's funny because it happens... The reason it's so realistic is because they're just hurrying on and trying to rush through the events so that they can get on to the next act as quickly as possible. But realistically speaking, if 3 cubes showed up in front of Voyager, what would not happen is modulate the shield, technobabble to this, and somehow manage it. No, what would happen is the 3 cubes would beat the tar out of Voyager and then win. That is what would happen. So, it was nice to see that. This brings me to a quote that has been debated ever since this episode came out, and has in fact spawned some side stories and a couple of books as well. But more to the point, to my knowledge, feel free to correct me on this, but for several people I've looked into on this, this was the origin point of the Q not being the Q. There's a long-standing theory that the Q are just very advanced aliens. You know, they're not actually as they pretend them to be, that they have very advanced technology, basically, right? Some of the seeds of that were planted in Death Wish with Quinn. Some of that was advanced within Q and the Grey, but most people I know who started really positing that theory did it here because of the line, "Don't provoke the Borg." Because it got the mind thinking, because of the earlier 2 episodes, well, hang on. Why? Why don't provoke the Borg? The idea being that maybe the Q continuum has genuine reason to fear the Borg under the right circumstances, and therefore just kind of... That's one possible theory. Another possible theory about the don't provoke the Borg line is that it's a joke. I don't buy that at all. I've never once thought that Q was saying that in a joking manner or as a joke. It seemed pretty serious to me. Which brings me to the third theory, which is also my personal theory, actually. Although I admit more and more, especially going read through Voyager, it seems more and more that the Q really are just advanced aliens. I never believed in that theory, but re-going through Voyager has pushed me in that direction, I'll admit it. We'll see what I think when I go back through TNG. Anyways, so the final theory, which was my original theory, is that the Borg are something that even the Q know not to mess with, basically. It's the kind of thing they leave alone. Remember how the Q were concerned about supernovae? They were causing them as unintentionally as part of the battle, but the point is that was considered a bad thing, even for the Continuum, to be detonating these supernova, to be causing the kind of changes that it's changing in the galaxy, was considered something that was unacceptable, that should be avoided, and therefore they were trying to work around it, okay? So in other words, the basic thought process here being that the Borg are kind of like a supernova, something that shouldn't be happening or shouldn't be provoked, just leave it alone. It's big, it's horrible, and it's galactically impacting. Just food for thought. So one of the funny things is Q has this line about Q2 where he mentions that he was supposed to bring order, not chaos. Which is funny because that's actually the exact opposite of true. Remember, the entire point of having the Q-child was to bring chaos. I don't mean chaos in the purest sense of the word, which is what most people think when they hear that, but I mean chaos in the sense of the opposite of entropy. As in something new, something changing, something different. New blood to spice up the Continuum. And despite the fact that Q2 has apparently been doing that, he is being, it is apparently considered a negative thing. However, I do have to admit, it's entirely possible, if I was to give the episode credits, which I am not, because this is not a great script, and it's not a great episode, but if I was going to give it credits, it could be possible that what Q means is that he is doing more of the same. That just about any Q goes through this phase of let's just mess with the lesser races, and then that leads to, the situation where they're like, this is just more of the same. We wanted something new. Show us something new. Which is funny because he doesn't show them something new. This has actually already been done in an episode called Q2. Oh, excuse me. Oh. So then Q goes to Janeway for parenting advice. Now I gotta be honest, Janeway's probably the worst of the Starfleet captains to go to for parenting advice. That's not true. I wasn't counting Archer. Second worst of the Starfleet captains to go to for parenting advice. Only because Archer is completely unqualified. I'm sorry, Janeway's not a mother or a parent. And I don't mean that biologically. Picard, ironically, despite being so anti-children for so much of his history, well, a decent chunk of his history anyways, was actually a very fatherly figure. And he did take a very fatherly approach to command. He liked people to be comfortable enough around him to be able to talk with them on a personal level and to treat them as if they were his family. That was one of the big themes of TNG, family. Janeway does not treat her crew as family. I've actually talked about this before. While the crew of Voyager is definitely family, Janeway doesn't actually quite slot into that all that well. She does occasionally, but depending on the writer, of course. But for the most part, she approaches it as if she's trying to do the distanced captain thing, right? So her, and just to add to this point, I'm going to skip ahead of my notes a little bit. She actually doesn't treat him as if he's a bad child or someone who needs to be disciplined, or as if he's part of her family. She treats him as if he's an officer, or a crewman, who has disobeyed orders and therefore needs to be punished on a, let's call it what it is, a military level. Now, some people will argue whether or not military discipline is something a child needs. I don't actually want to get into that debate, because that really boils down to opinion, so there's not a lot to discuss there. But I just pointed out because it hammers my point in that Janeway is not a frickin' parent, and going to her for parenting advice only happens because, well, it's the only Star Trek show that happens to be live at the moment, and Patrick Stewart's off doing whatever else. They do at least mention Picard at one point in here. So then Q acts as if the concept of consequences is alien to him. Like, it never occurred to him to try and demonstrate consequences to Q2. I find that interesting since Q himself has had consequences put upon him more than once. More than 3 times, actually. In fact, Q having to face consequences, or dealing with consequences in some way or another, is actually one of the more common themes of Q episodes, including the last 2 he was in on Voyager. So, it's really weird for me that he perceives as like, aha, consequences. And then, of course, we have a very continuum thing. Now, I've spoken out against the continuum before, and I'll be talking about this more when we get to TNG, but it is very continuum to say, you have a week to straighten up or you're screwed forever. The continuum have always been extremely draconian. Very, this will happen. The punishment is extremely severe for even the tiniest slight, and you will do exactly as we say or else everything. That's always been the continuum's approach. This is also true even on Voyager, and again, it has been in both Q and the Grey and Death Wish. So, it is very in keeping with the Continuum's character. In fact, I noted that. The only reason I wrote that note down is because it's one of the very few moments in this episode where a character, in this case the entirety of the Continuum being a character, is actually acting in character. If you really sit back and think about it, Q is not acting in character here. There are very few aspects of Q's performance that are in character. In fact, there's 2, and I wrote down both of them. The rest of it's just kind of like someone who's never written Q before trying to write Q. Or someone who's heard of Q trying to write Q, and completely ignoring any development or movement of his character over the last few years. And the same thing with Q too, really. And Janeway herself, aside from the military thing I mentioned earlier, just bounces all over the place as far as the character map. It's not that well portrayed. Even Neelix gets a bad showing in this episode. And you can tell the difference between me and Sci-Fi Debris, because for him, he would say, of course, Neelix gets a bad showing in this episode, because he always does. But as I think I've been making clear as we've been going through this, Neelix has actually been developing quite a bit as a character, basically from Season 3 onwards, and has actually moved on to being an actual character rather than a caricature. And yet in this episode, he basically just reverts back to being a caricature for the course of the episode. It's embarrassing, to be blunt. Then there's a line that is almost ignored, and it's part of the underlying theme that I shouldn't say that. I feel like the original intent of the episode was to be about expectations, about what it feels like for Q2 to literally have the weight of the Continuum on his shoulders, and the fact that he's been acting out so much because of this weight that he can't endure, and this burden that is beyond him. The reason I say that was probably one of the original intended themes and is not a theme of the episode is because it's given lip service twice, maybe 3 times if you want to stretch it, throughout the course of the episode. And it's immediately ignored and moved on. It's like, yep, okay, that's great, move on to the next plot point. Like, not even a beat is spent on examining that point or trying to divest that point into something more complex, more substance, other than just, I've got the weight of the Continuum on my shoulders, moving on. And I'm pretty sure the only reason they even mentioned the word expectations later was as a wordplay thing. But I find that a shame, because I think that would have been a more interesting episode. A young Q who is literally acting out because he has no idea what he's doing and is afraid to admit it. There's kernels of an idea there, of characters, of a character arc, of the possibility of him actually growing and learning, whereas throughout the course of the episode he kind of doesn't. I mean, Q2 claims he learns, and he does demonstrate learning, but at the same time, he doesn't actually have a character arc in this episode. And I think I've mentioned this before, but I think a lot of that is down to Keegan, the actor, because I think he was supposed to portray an asshole, stupid brat kid, slow transition, and then transition into the final step, the 3 steps of this character arc. And of course, they only have 1 episode to do that, and that's pretty tricky to pull off for an experienced actor. Keegan was not that old when this episode came out, and obviously did not have the acting chops to actually do that, and he doesn't. There is almost no change in his overall performance. In fact, if I was to describe Keegan's performance, I'd say he watched some of the Season 1 Q episodes and just started saying, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to mimic my father. And that's how he did his performance. He basically is playing someone who's playing Q. Is someone. I've talked about this before. This came up in Body and Soul, I think, where Jerry Ryan, Jerry Ryan's, God, I can't remember her name. In Seven, the actress who plays Seven was playing a caricature of Robert Picardo's performance of the Doctor. Now, I gave her some praise for that, and I understand why she did that, and it was unusual, the circumstances. But ultimately, it's something that tends to happen when you try to act like another actor acts in their role. You take the mannerisms and the movements that they do and you exaggerate them. It's one of the reasons why most people, when they're doing a William Shatner impression, always, suddenly, talk like this. Well, William Shatner himself has done that on more than one occasion. If you've seen any of his work, even on just Star Trek, he doesn't actually act like that. That's just a mannerism that he uses occasionally. But when you're doing a performance of someone else doing a performance, you tend to pick up on things like that and exaggerate them, and then people will look at your performance and exaggerate them, and so forth and so on. So, what I'm saying is, I think Keegan was literally doing that for John Delancey's portrayal of Q, trying to just perform it as if he was exaggerating those characteristics and coming across as a caricature of Q. And that kind of thing is hard to pull off even if you're a good actor, which Keegan is not. So any attempt at character arc basically falls completely flat on its face in this episode. Not just for the establishment reasons, but for the acting reasons. That brings me to the Icheb situation. It's a shame that the Icheb friendship is not actually fleshed out, because it should have been. I really hate to bring this up, but I can't help but notice the corollary here. There's an MLP, My Little Pony episode, and I don't know the name of it, where Discord, who's played by John Delancey, and one of the ponies, I can't think of her name, are basically trying to become friends. And almost the entire episode, like a good 80% of the episode, is spent on her going way out of her way to be nice to him, to be understanding to him, to forgive him for things, and basically acting as a friend to him, thus making the final point of, oh my god, I actually have a friend for the first time in my life, have some meaning. I bring that up because I feel like, even though that came after this episode, I feel like that was the intent with Q2 and Icheb, that Q2 would have a friend for the first part of his life, and therefore value that friendship for the obvious reasons that most people value friendships, and therefore lead to his eventual realization and willingness to sacrifice. Now, I bring that up because almost no time is spent on the two's interaction. They meet a couple of times. Icheb's like, I'll help you with the essay. And then, let's get into the thing. And then, hey, let's go repair the ship. And then, hey, let's flee. And that's basically it. There's no establishment whatsoever. Again, hammering that point in. And I think that's a damn shame because logically, Icheb is actually a really good pick to be a friend for Q2. The two have many similar situations and qualities. And Icheb is a sufficiently tolerant and intelligent person to be able to both comprehend and put up with someone like Q2. And Icheb himself also had great expectations put on him. Twice. And Icheb himself is ultimately an outsider on this crew. Just like Q2 is. So there's a lot of potential there for the two of them to grow into a real friendship. But instead it's just like, hey, these two are friends, go. Then, of course, Q misses the point. Why does Q miss the point? There's a scene where Q2 gives the essay. Now, again, the essay itself is not the point, and Q misses that. I hate to hammer this again, but again, it's very out of character for Q. For all his arrogance, he is not stupid. He's not so stupid as to not recognize the merit and value of establishment and of work, as opposed to just... And again, that's the actual concurrent theme throughout the episode. And then he insists that Janeway is not up to the task, which is stupid for two reasons. Number one, if he expects Janeway, a not captain, not parent, human, so not captain, not parent, not Q, to pull out Q-ness in Q2, that's the first reason it's stupid. Second reason it's stupid is he I'm sorry. I'm trying to think of a way to rephrase this, but I guess I'm just going to rehash my earlier point. Q himself seems to be completely missing the relevant point of establishment. I know, I've said that, so I'm just going to move on, but that's the other reason it's stupid, because Q is missing the point and missing the obvious. I'm sorry, I'm kind of sick right now. Give me just a moment. Oh my goodness. Then, Q2 runs away. Now that actually is very in character. It's probably the one thing Q2 does that I'm like, yes, I'm with that. And I know it sounds weird. I remember once when a little 6-year-old girl was like, I'm going to run away. I'm very upset, so I'm going to run away. Because that's basically what Q2 is doing. Obviously, a grown child running away from home is not exactly a small deal, and I would be lying to you if I said I wasn't terrified in the moment of how to deal with that situation. It was a very scary thought. But the reality here, the cold reality, is the fact that that is a very childlike decision, because it's all about not wanting, supplanting reality with whatever you want to think about it, and completely ignoring consequence. So he's just like, nope, we're just gonna leave. We're gonna go. Q will never be able to find me. No, it'll never happen. It's the same mentality behind, a child who runs away from home, walks 30 feet, and then camps out in the driveway. It's the exact same mentality. It's just a childlike reaction to something without actually thinking things through, usually done for emotional reasons. Then Q has a line, and I mentioned this because it's one of the only times where Q actually acts in character, where he says, maybe if your friend has to die for you to understand consequence, then so be it. It's probably one of the very few lines that struck me as actually in character for Q, and made sense for Q to say that, and I liked that. I have a line here. I've kind of already mentioned this. In fact, I already referenced it. But I do wonder, do you think, because I've already given my opinion first, but do you think Q2 would have been able to pass Q's little test if not for all the stuff he went through on Voyager, if not for all the establishment, the build-up, the understanding of limitations and consequences? Would he have been able to make the same choice that he made in order to sacrifice himself both for Icheb and for Janeway? Food for thought. Final thoughts. This is something I've kind of been building to, technically. Whoa, I just nearly lost my notes. Q, at the end, gives Janeway homework. Some of the books, actually, I'm sorry, one book I know of and one other story, which isn't actually a book, but whatever, directly makes it clear that the homework Q gave her leads her straight to that Borg conduit, with the intent of getting them home and or dealing with the Borg conduit. Make of that what you will. But I bring it up more. I'm going to make this point, damn it. Because the thing that's not really been addressed, in fact, it hasn't even been brought up in Death Wish and in Q and the Grey, is why don't the Q them back home? Now, we, of course, know why that is, because from an out-of-character perspective, that would be an extremely cheap way for them to finally get home. But you still have to make a true, solid, in-character reason for that to happen. Because the Q can them back home. So why don't they? So why doesn't he? Why doesn't Q2, for that matter? Being so grateful to Janeway and all that. Or to Icheb. Why don't they? The closest thing that I've ever heard of an answer, which was never posited at all in any of the official works, is the idea that there was some destiny that Voyager had to fulfill. That Voyager had to go forward and actually do certain events and be a part of certain events, and those had a significant impact on the way that not just the Delta Quadrant, but the galaxy as a whole developed. And without those events, things would have gone so drastically differently, and they would have not been basically the Kirks of their era. And that's not a bad idea if Voyager actually had them doing that, which it doesn't. We can infer that from STO, though. I know I hate to keep bringing up STO, but so many of the things that Voyager did and went through, leading to their eventual comeback at the end in Endgame, did make certain things line up pretty well for STO not only to happen, but to go positively for the good guys. It's quite debatable that the Delta Quadrant situation, and especially the Iconian situation, would have gone much, much worse without Voyager's contribution. So, okay, fine. That's a reasonable explanation. But my reason for bringing it up is it's frankly cheap on behalf of the writers to basically toss away with a flippant line, sorry, can't do things the easy way. Even if Q might do that, that is, from a writing perspective, that is flat lazy. And the fact that they didn't bring it up at all in the previous 2 episodes is also lazy. It should have been addressed, and some real time and effort should have been put into establishing why the Q aren't sending them back. But I digress. That's all I got. Thank God next episode's going to be a better one. We're going to be coming back with Author, which I'll be recording in probably about an hour here, so I hope you'll be able to endure my being sick for another hour. See you around, guys.